The following podcast is created and sponsored by High Beam Ministry.
The theological term is called supersessionism. It's also known as replacement theology. And the idea behind it is this. Well, a long time ago, God said to the Jews in Israel, he said, listen, you guys are my chosen people, and my covenant promises to bless you are for everlasting. But then, supposedly, when Israel sinned, this took God totally by surprise. It's as if God said, I made this covenant with you, but then you Jews fell into disobedience. If I knew that they were going to sin, I never would have given them this everlasting covenant with them in the first place. But how was I supposed to know? Who do you think I am? God or something? So, now you Jews, now that you've surprised me, you've left me no choice but to remove my covenant blessings from you and transfer those blessings to the nice and always obedient church, to where the church is my new Israel now, and you Jews, well, you're just kind of like, meh. And that's replacement theology. On average, more than 6 out of 10 churches in North America believe some form of replacement theology. But, surprise, it's not biblical.
Welcome to the Erzatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead. Hey, Amazing Larry, I see you're taking a break. Mind if I sit down with you?
Yeah, I just can't stop reading this book that you gave me from Bridges for Peace called Israel and the Church, God's Road Map. Oh, it's so good.
Isn't it a great book?
Well, it just explains so many questions that I've had about Israel and the church, because there is kind of a split there, right?
Oh, yeah.
And there's some tensions, and it's been historical, and it's probably current as well. But this book is just full of just good wisdom.
It is. I love it because it talks about the seedbed, if you want to put it that way, out of which Christianity grew, the nursery. And then it talks about how we've split and separated from the Jewish community, and that's created some problems. But it's also beginning to show us how we can come back together again, kind of like two sides of the same family.
Well, my next door neighbors, I got to tell you, they're two brothers. One's older, like 10 years, and they moved in side by side, bought houses together. And I'm telling you, they are opposites, day and night. One believes one way and one believes another. But you know something? At the end of the day, they're still brothers.
That's a perfect picture of how it should be between Israel and the church, the Jews and the church, the synagogue and the church. It is amazing that God has a plan that encapsulates and basically surrounds both sides of the family. And we need to have both sides of the family moving together, shoulder to shoulder, to see God's plan fulfilled.
I do care that they understand who the Messiah is, but that's not going to influence me how I love them, how I honor them, and how I serve them. Do you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
I am a Christian. I am a follower of Jesus, but I'm not about to force that on anybody. I love the Jews. I love what they stand for. I love their theology. I love their book. It is a Jewish book, the Bible.
You do realize that everything that we have came from the nation of Israel, the Jewish people.
Absolutely. I love it.
Right.
But why are we so ignorant in the West or in the Western church?
You hit the active word, ignorant. We are ignorant. And the reason we're ignorant is many people who call themselves Christians today don't know their Bible, and they don't know history. They have to understand the Bible, and then they have to understand the last 2,000 years of history in order to get to the point where you're at and where I'm coming from, working with Bridges for Peace and endorsing them and really working with them to reach out to the Jewish community in Israel.
Well, let's unpack one chapter here in this segment, and it's about replacement theology, and I know you're an expert on this.
Oh, yeah, okay. And that's why I'm going to walk through this chapter with you.
Let me say that I had been a Christian many years before this term term actually got into my vocabulary. I had no idea what replacement theology was.
Well, the key to it is it's a theology of how the church replaced the Jewish people. That's what it comes down to. If you read the Bible, the church did not replace the Jewish people. However, if you have something against the Jewish people, or you don't know how to read the Bible in context, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that the church replaced the Jewish people.
Do you think sometimes that just out of some ignorance that theologians just said, well, it's like a rocket going into space. The first stage was Israel. The second stage, obviously, is the church. So Israel played a part in boosting forth God's message, and now we, the church, take it further.
But now we have to destroy that analogy because it is not correct.
Okay.
If you look according to the Bible, you will see something totally different.
Okay.
We were meant to be side by side because Christianity started within Judaism. It was a sect, a stream in Judaism that believed Jesus was the Messiah. And for a period of time, they all kind of went side by side. If there were fights, they were like interfamily fights. Just like in Christianity, you see disputes and debates between Protestants and Catholics or between Lutherans and Pentecostals. That's the same type of sectarian fighting there was within the Jewish community. And by the way, that's a very healthy thing because it helps clarify our thoughts and our understanding. However, the problem came in when Gentiles started coming into this Jewish stream and started joining the synagogues. And the question was, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles? What you need to do is you need to educate Gentiles about Judaism, especially this Messianic stream, which they were. However, there were times when more and more Gentiles were coming in, and because of significant events in history, such as AD 70, the Romans destroyed the temple, leveled Jerusalem, and dispersed the Jews, and in 135 there was another Jewish revolt, and that same type of thing happened again. Well, pretty soon the Jewish presence was erased or limited in the land. The same thing was happening in the church. As more and more Gentiles were coming in and more Jews were leaving because of anti-Semitism and because many Jews didn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah, it became a more Gentilized church, as Don Finto puts it, a pastor who has been doing research in this area. The church became more and more Gentilized. More and more Gentile thinking came into the church, which forced the Jewish thinking out of the church. Pretty soon you have an organization and a theology that looks nothing like its original.
Well, you know what's very interesting, because in the first church, everybody was in Jerusalem. They were all Jews, all in Jerusalem.
All reading a Jewish text.
And it all seemed like all of a sudden persecution happened to kind of break up the fellowship.
God used that to get the word out because many Jews were dispersed around the Roman Empire.
Right.
So it was like the Holy Spirit blowing on a dandelion, and the seeds went out along the Jewish lines. See, it went from the synagogues in Jerusalem to the synagogues in Samaria, which were northern Israel. It went into the synagogues at Antioch. It went into the synagogues. In fact, where this originally started was on Shavuot, or what we in the church call Pentecost. All of these Jews were in town, but they were from throughout the Roman Empire. And so God now inspires the original disciples, followers of Jesus, and they proclaimed God's works in the tongues of these people, and they got the message. They carried the message out, which is why Paul, when he's traveling around, did find Jewish believers in Messiah throughout the Jewish Empire. He just gathered them together and started organizing them.
You know, it must have broke God's heart to see that his family, Jew and Gentile, who were supposed to come together in Jesus, right?
Right.
To be so separate and really get to the point where centuries have proven they hate each other, or at least some hate each other. You know, I mean, God's heart was for those to be one new man, and yet we see in history how it just worked the opposite way.
Right. One of the theological terms I've come across, it's popular in theologian circles, is it's, quote, the parting of the ways, unquote. Well, there's been a lot of research recently over our past history and found out the parting of the ways really wasn't as distinct as you thought. Christians and Jews have often interacted over the last 2,000 years, many times not so nice, but sometimes in very good ways as well, as they've kind of taught each other and learned from each other. But the amazing thing in our day, that parting of the ways is starting to weld together. Now, we're not one in Jesus, which we as evangelicals believe is going to happen eventually, but we are learning to understand each other. We're learning how to talk to one another, and we're willing to work side by side with each other. And by the way, Bridges for Peace that published this book, they're key in this whole idea of bringing Jews and Christians together in relationship and working together. But let's go back and talk about this replacement theology.
Yes.
Okay, the fancy name is supersessionism. Supersede something basically means to take something's place. And this grew out of the fact that, well, as there was a natural kind of split in the Jewish community regarding Jesus, when Jerusalem was taken down in AD 70, and then further basically erased or leveled in 135, a lot of the church, and I'm putting that in air quotes, looked back and said, aha, that's judgment on the Jewish people because of rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. Now, they get that actually from the Gospels. There are some scriptures where Jesus said, okay, because you didn't receive me, I'm going to take you down, Jerusalem. However, what you have to understand is he's not talking about the Jewish people as a whole. He was talking to the people of his day. It happened to be the Jewish leadership and those people who had gone along with God's plan of Jesus' execution. That was their rejection. That's their punishment. But Jesus is not leveling that punishment against the entire Jewish people because they're back in the land. And it wasn't against the entire nation forever because the nation now is back as it was prophesied. So that eliminates that part. However, when you're in that day and you see all of these things happening, how do you now explain the prophecies that apply to Israel, but Israel doesn't exist? So it was a natural jump for the church at the time, as it was growing through the 300s and 400s, to look back and say, those prophecies must apply to the new Israel, which is the church that believes in Jesus. And that's where this replacement theology started to really flower.
Well, and then there were those, what we call, or somebody calls, church fathers got involved and really wrote some things about the Jews that were not kind. And we'll pick that up in another segment as we go through the book. But again, it was the foundation of the church and the leadership that started to push and separate the two apart.
Right. In fact, funny you should mention that. I've got a quote here that I've highlighted in the book. It said this: the early church fathers who looked at these historical events were convinced that this was positive proof that God was finished with Israel and that the church had assumed Israel's former role in the purposes of God. And the sufferings of the Jewish people did not end with the cruel Roman legions. The history of the Jewish people since that time has been filled with tragedy. For replacement theology proponents, this sad history confirms the belief that God is indeed finished with Israel. But that's a stupid circular argument. They're saying God is finished with the people. Why? Because he judged the people, and because he judged the people, God is finished with the people. It's a dumb circular argument. You have to look at Bible prophecy and history together in a linear fashion to understand God's plan. It was his plan for the gospel to go to the Gentiles, and from my perspective, it should have been a Jewish gospel that went to the Gentiles, into which the Gentiles were attached. But the sad part is with history and with Christian anti-Semitism, the Gentiles took it and ran with it and kicked the Jews off the track. And hence you have many of the problems that are still inherent in the church today.
I have a friend that comes in here every once in a while. His name is Chris.
Yeah.
And Chris is a little bit ADD, but I love him to death.
Are you kidding? He's like a squirrel on crack. Are you kidding?
But you know what he does?
What?
He comes in and he says, Christianity is Jewish. And I said, what? Christianity is Jewish, he says. And then he unpacks everything that supports that. But I'd never heard that before.
Once you get that into your head, you suddenly realize how valuable Israel and the Jewish people are to Christians, and we really should reach out to them. Getting back to that history thing, we were talking about, can history prove replacement theology? It could, until Israel became a nation and the Jews started coming out of the nations. Suddenly, replacement theology went out the window in 1948, because you can't say that God was done with the Jews if God is bringing the Jews back to a reconstituted land. Replacement theology is debunked. It is false. The problem is, after being steeped in it for 2,000 years, this Christian community has to identify it, and it has to renounce it, and it has to turn away from it and look with new eyes.
I love that, Truth Barista. there is one replacement that I really do believe in.
And what is that?
Well, it's the replacement of my empty coffee cup.
You have to replace the coffee you drank.
That's exactly right. And I guess that's the only validity and replacement for me anyway.
Could you get me a double espresso, and could you triple the whipped cream on that?
Thank you for joining us today. In today's world, we need to know more about life than what we are fed through our normal channels of communication. Even in many of our churches, we are not hearing the whole truth about God and His Word. Pastors today are often afraid to address the themes in culture that might get them to be targeted by the cancel culture. Congregations are divided on the issues, and it makes a pastor's job more difficult to address those spiritual areas that might divide the church. This was one of the reasons the Truth Barista came into existence. We wanted to provide a message without any strings attached or be subjected to division in the church. We want to bring you a strong biblical message that doesn't come with limitations or restrictions on what can be said. No one wants to have information withheld from them, right? We all want to know the truth. The Truth Barista is a podcast that brings you truth based on God's Word, the Bible. We hope that you'll become a regular listener and be informed on the truth concerning the issues of our day. Join the RSS family by providing your email address on our website, and you'll be sent a link every time a new podcast comes out. Our website is highbeamministry.com. That's highbeamministry.com.
Okay, you back?
I am back.
That looks good.
I know it.
Okay, let's talk about replacement theology. Turn to your page that says, "Can replacement theology be argued from the New Testament?"
Yes. Okay.
I'll explain why that's important. Because let's say, and I'm just using the church is kind of an anachronism. The church didn't really become the church until the 300-400s. It was just that messianic stream with Gentiles coming in. Okay. A lot of people look at the church basing its replacement theology on the New Testament. And there are certainly verses in the New Testament that seem to indicate that God was done with Israel and the Jewish people because of disobedience. It certainly looks like some of the scriptures in the New Testament, the apostolic scriptures, look anti-Semitic, which is really ridiculous because this book was written by Jews, so how can a Jew be anti-Semitic in what he's writing? That should be your first clue that we're reading it with eyes that aren't right. So we have to replace the glasses. So we go from glasses that are stained with replacement theology and perhaps anti-Semitism and put on glasses of the day in the context and saying, for example, when you read the Gospel of John, have you ever noticed that John is talking about the Jews? He's going, and it was because of the Jews or the Jews that were there. A lot of people are going, wow, John is really hacking on the Jews. Well, John was Jewish. Right. So when you go back and you look, which Jews was he picking on? That's the key. And when you really study the text and get into it and are honest, he's talking about the Jewish leadership, those who were in control. There were other Jews that looked at Jesus and received him. John writes that down. There are other Jews out there that didn't receive him, and that was primarily, in John's eyes, the leadership. You look at some of Paul's writings. Over the years, Paul looks like he's saying the church has replaced the Jews. But if you read the book of Romans, that totally destroys that, even though they try to use Romans to replace the Jews. You've read Romans.
Oh, I love Romans. In fact, some people say that Romans can be defined by chapters 9, 10, and 11, because that is really what some commentators will say Romans is all about, and that's where he talks about the Jews.
Exactly. 9, 10, and 11 is the core of the book, but most people like to read up chapter 8, and then they put the book down, and they may read some of the nice stuff at the end. But really, 9, 10, 11 is the most important book of the Bible. What happened is Paul is writing to a synagogue, a messianic synagogue of Jews and Gentiles in Rome. And during the Roman times, during those times, an edict was put out so that all of the Jews were expelled from Rome. Well, after a few years, 3 to 4 years, the Jews are allowed to come back to Rome and they're coming back to these synagogues. But who's been running the synagogue for the last 3, 4 years? It's now the Gentile believers. Well, the Gentile believers, and you can pick this up from the tone of the book, are getting arrogant and going, well, you Jews were expelled and now you're back and you expect to pick up where you left off, kind of an attitude. And there was this theology of, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do this and you're not walking according to, and look at the rest of your people over there and blah, blah, blah. And Paul is saying, no, you Gentiles are saved the same way Jews are, and Jews are saved the same way the Gentiles are. That's the first part of the book all the way up to 8. Then Paul gets to the crux. He looks at the Gentiles and goes, don't you dare be arrogant, because if God rejected the Jews, kind of keying off of that expulsion from Rome and the issues that they're having with Israel, he says, if God broke off some of the branches from the natural tree, how much easier would it be to break off branches that were grafted in? And I'll tell you something, from a horticultural point of view, once there's a graft, that is much easier to break off than a natural branch that's grown out of the tree. Paul basically sums it up and he says, don't be arrogant. It's not the church that supports the Jews. It's the Jews that support the Gentile church.
Well, a lot of folks will say that if God isn't faithful to his promises to Israel and he has ignored those promises, what's keeping him from ignoring the promises to the church?
Precisely.
And so, Israel is sort of a litmus test of God's faithfulness to his promises, whether it be to the Jew and Israel and or to the Gentiles and the church.
Mm-hmm. In fact, part of God's plan is also laid out in Paul's letter 9 through 11. If you're going back through 10:1, Paul's heart is for the Jewish people. He says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the church is that they may be saved. The church is already saved. By definition, the church is the company of committed. You cannot replace Israel with the word church. As you go through the book of Romans and any other scriptures, it doesn't make sense. So here we go, Romans 11:25b. Blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. That's part of God's plan. It's not a permanent rejection of the Jewish people. But if you go with the replacement theologian's idea, you have to replace the word Israel there with the church. How much sense does it now make? Blindness in part has happened to the church until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in.
Doesn't make any sense.
No, but what you're seeing there is God's plan is God is saying, he's got to reach the uttermost parts of the earth. So while Israel went through a terrible time under the Romans and were dispersed, Paul is going, aha, in this I see a plan of God. He is using this dispersion to get the gospel into the Gentile world. And then he says, once the full number of the Gentiles comes in other words, his full plan to reach the Gentile world has come in, he's going to turn back and he's going to scoop up, and he says, all Israel. And what's amazing to me, the more I think about that, you can't say that of any other group, organization, nation, anything in the world other than Israel and the Jewish community. God is going to come back to his people in a profound way, and every single one of them will be scooped up into his arms. And us Gentiles who sat back and said, God is all done with Israel and the Jewish people, are going to be sitting there, maybe finding ourselves on the outside. And that's what Paul is warning the Roman believers about. Don't you dare get arrogant. He can snap you off faster than he snaps off the natural branches. So I think you all better just kind of cling to the tree and enjoy the spiritual sap that's coming through the Jewish community all the way back to the root in Abraham.
I love what the Apostle Paul does in 2nd chapter of Ephesians, where he talks about God is looking for that one new man, right? Breaking down the wall of separation and bringing Jew and Gentile together for one new man in Messiah.
Exactly. What's really fascinating to me is when God's plan comes to fruition, speaking of trees, when Messiah returns, he's the Jewish king. He's coming back to a reconstituted Israel. He's coming back to a regathered people and will regather every one of his people into his kingdom. And for 1,000 years, as part of God's prophesied plan, for 1,000 years, this Jewish Messiah will rule from a Jewish throne in a Jewish Jerusalem, in a Jewish nation. They will be the firstborn eldest son of God over all of the nations of the world. Doesn't mean that he's going to be stomping on the nations of the world. It just means that Israel's going to get preeminent.
Well, he will hold the nations of the world accountable. That is true. But
absolutely true.
As we draw this portion to a conclusion, Truth Barista, you've said some absolutely astounding things, and I hope people will go back and re-listen to some of your thoughts because they were very, very good.
And you know something even better, though? get the book.
Well, I was going to go there, that's one of the things they can do is listen to you and read the book, and so they have a double whammy there. But how do they get the book? Where do they go?
Go to bridgesforpeace.com. That's all one word, bridgesforpeace.com. You go to the store, which is up on the menu bar. Look for Israel and the Church, God's Roadmap. And they have some limited copies available right now. We're going to encourage them to start publishing a lot more, but you definitely have to get this book. And what's really nice about it is when you go through these chapters, at the end of the chapters are study questions that you can use, and then there's even a prayer and how to apply what you've learned in that chapter. It is a very educational and practical book.
Let's just conclude, Truth Barista, on give us just a closing thought on what we do with replacement theology for those of us who realize how wrong it is.
First of all, we need to study the Bible. We need to learn church history. Okay, those are the two things. We need to remove the ignorance. Number two, we need to be able to recognize replacement theology when we hear it. Number three, we need to reject replacement theology lovingly and even more assert positively that replacement theology doesn't exist. In fact, God has been using the Jews and the Gentiles side by side for the last 2,000 years, and we're beginning to see it now manifest in a whole new way. I like the way this chapter closes out. You mind if I read a small part of it?
No, go ahead.
I like this. Jews are Jews, Israel is still Israel, and the church is the church. The Jewish people are forever God's covenant people, and through them all nations have been blessed. Has Israel been replaced? Well, here are Paul's words from Romans 11, selections of them. Certainly not. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. So all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come out of Zion. And as a side note, not New York City and not the Vatican, okay? Will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. In other words, God doesn't take them back. He doesn't rescind them. And then Paul just on this realization erupts in a psalm of praise. Oh, the depths of the riches both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. We need to realize that though we may not understand it, God has a plan going forward, and it includes the Gentiles and the Jews. And if the Christian and the church were wise, we would get in step with God's plan.
We've all heard the saying, keep the main thing the main thing. When we apply that to Jesus Christ, he is the main thing. There hasn't been anyone like him in history, and he has contributed more to humanity than all contributors combined. He is the main thing.
This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast. The best way to find out when a new podcast drops is through RSS feed. Go to our website, look for the RSS button, press it, and then enter your email. You'll be notified when a new podcast drops. Thanks for listening.